I'm going to be controversial here, right? Because for me, the concept of Muslims as an ethnic identity, that Muslims are like the third ethnicity in Sri Lanka. I mean, that for me is a fallacy. Islam was never an ethnic identity. It came in and absorbed different things.
Hi everyone, my name is Amina Mohsin. I am the co-founder of the SL Reconciliation Movement and the Easter Attack Survivors Project. Today, my third episode of my podcast, Picking Up the Pieces, I have with me my friend and colleague, Dr. Amjad Saleem. Amjad has worked extensively with the youth. He continues to work at the Red Cross. He's worked in conflict resolution situations, disaster management, and community engagement. And he's a brilliant person to hear and learn from. So I'd like to introduce all the listeners to this episode. In this episode, we'd particularly be talking about the pre and post Easter Sunday attack context of community leadership and youth engagement in preventing violent extremism and radicalization. Welcome, Dr. Amjad, and thank you for joining me on this episode. To start off, Amjad, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What drives you? What has brought you to this moment?
Great. No, thank you very much, Amina. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking to you today. And I guess with context, today is Easter Sunday in 2024. So we're about 5 years from the commemoration of, or we're 5 years on from Easter Sunday, the Easter Sunday attack. So it's a real poignant time to be here speaking about this issue in particular, but also speaking about the context behind it. And it's very important, I think, for us to kind of look at the context. So thank you for having me and thank you for the introduction. So my name is as you said, Amjad Saleem. I am a third culture kid. For those people who don't know third culture kids are kids who basically are born in one country, who have a heritage from another country, and who often end up living in a different country. So in that sense, I am, so my parents obviously are of Sri Lankan heritage, but I'm British. But I was born in and spent a lot of my time in Africa as a kid because my father worked for international systems. So he worked for the World Bank, the UN. So I've kind of moved around a lot in my childhood, and even now with work, continue to move different countries, working for work that I do with the Red Cross. So I think that's myself in a nutshell, having picked up multiple identities of who I am, in terms of at different levels, kind of picking up what drives me, what makes me there. What drives me, a lot of what my influence, particularly in the work that I'm doing now, is effectively an influence from my parents, particularly my father. And I think I carried on in the family business, so to speak, of working in the international sector with, for following his footsteps. One of the things that he really, when I was younger, would always remind me of is the privilege that I had of growing up in a different country. But growing up, when you work for the UN and everything else, you have things that are paid for, your education is paid for, and all of these things in there. So there's a lot of privilege that you have as a child of the UN, so to speak. And there were two ways that I could go in that privilege, right? So I could use that privilege to effectively cause positive change in people. So use that to kind of bring up and create opportunities to influence change for those people who don't have that privilege. Or I could use that privilege for my own personal benefit, right? You get to go to good universities, and then you get to, your pathways often is laid down. So for a while, he did remind me of that, and so why I do what I do now is because I think he reminded me that the blessing and the privilege of having had that journey laid out for me allows me then to kind of see how many people I can bring with me on that journey, and that was something that he believed very strongly about. It's something that I got involved in. I grew up in Ethiopia, so I was very, very conscious of what development work looked like, what conflict looked like. This was the time when there was a massive civil war in Ethiopia, and there was a communist regime. So I grew up in that atmosphere, and so I really sort of was quite interested in how do you effect change how do you create change, how do you create policy changes, how do you provide immediate relief to the people. And so, I went on and did civil engineering at university with the aim to actually go out and work in the development sector or work in that space. And I didn't really get a chance to do that until the tsunami of 2004, and then that was when I was able to sort of come out and use my skills to build houses there. So, I mean, that's in short who I am. But I've of course now moved away from engineering. I'm sort of got more involved in peace building, conflict resolution, sort of organizational development. And then in the midst of that, I also decided that I wanted to understand a little bit more about my own history, my own heritage. I was very, very fascinated by the Sri Lankan Muslim journey. And so I did a PhD looking at the transformation of Sri Lankan Muslim identity over the last 150 years and what that looks like, just to get an understanding for myself. Because I was never born in Sri Lanka. I never grew up in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka for me was at best where my grandparents were, where my parents came from. We would often come back for holidays, summer holidays, when it's there. My parents are originally from the east, so a large portion of that we weren't able to come back because of the conflict. So at best it just remained this place somewhere in the distance. So I really wanted to kind of understand where I came from in terms of who I am, what drives me, what my identity is, and that then allows me then to kind of figure out where I'm going, right? So that's how I've sort of got involved in the Sri Lankan kind of conversation. And of course, helping my father when he was alive, when he was doing a lot of community work in Sri Lanka. So I would sort of support him there. But yeah, that's myself in a little bit of a nutshell.
Thank you, Amjad. Amjad, if you don't mind, could you just speak a little bit about who your father was and what role did he play in his era, so to say, of working with the UN?
Yeah. So where do I start? I mean, my father, my father was he's known as Dr. Muhammad Saleem. So he's the first Dr. Muhammad Saleem. I'm the second. He, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the first people in his town to get a PhD, from that part of the world. He got his PhD in Nigeria and was there. He ended up joining a UN World Bank program looking at agriculture and livestock because he was an agricultural scientist, and then spent a large portion of his time in Africa, both in Nigeria, Ethiopia, there, and he became head of a mountain agriculture program. He pioneered some research into a particular type of crop, which is then used. It sort of pioneered, innovated how people look at livestock and look at how they use livestock for agriculture. And then he retired. He retired very early in his life. In fact, I think he would have gone for another 10 years, but he actually retired early. He could have settled back in the UK because that was the options were there, and he chose not to. He chose to come back to Sri Lanka because he felt that he had done a lot outside, and he wanted to come back to Sri Lanka to kind of give back to the country and to kind of, he said that, I was born in Sri Lanka, I want to die in Sri Lanka. And so that's what he did, I mean, much to the surprise of everyone, thinking that, you have an opportunity to go back and settle, and he didn't, and he chose to come back. And when he came back, he got involved in a number of programs, but he sort of started to work around interfaith engagement, working with different communities of Buddhist monks, the church, and then he got involved. He became president of the Mahatma Gandhi Center, for which he was there for about 7 or 8 years. He was there doing a lot of work, again working in community development, community leadership, helping communities to understand how they can interact with each other. He strongly believed that Sri Lanka was he called it a spiritual country. So he said the 4 great religions are there, and as such as a spiritual strength that comes out of that. And there's this particular role that faith leaders have, and their role is to kind of be that moral compass for society. And he really truly believed that was something that was missing in Sri Lanka, and that he wanted to cultivate at the grassroots level for faith leaders to understand their role beyond just leading prayers and acts of worship, but to really take that stance to kind of lead society in that way. And so he worked very closely with the religious communities because he felt like that was something that was there. And he managed to have a number of impacts. There were some things that he did that was recognized by the Commonwealth, that was recognized in the Lessons Learned, the Rehabilitation Commission, LLRC report has something around the role of faith leaders and all things. So I think he tried to kind of push that conversation, because he truly believed that they were an unspoken, unused resource that needed to be utilized better, particularly in the absence of any other community leadership. And to some extent, I also believe that, right? And I've seen, particularly in times of crisis, communities often reach out to the faith organizations, faith leaders, for source of support, source of inspiration, and it's up to them then to kind of help to navigate that tension. And so it's something there that I think that we still haven't fully got right in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Amjad. To move on, I'm still in the introduction phase. I'd like to set the stage for anyone who doesn't know who you are or who has heard a little bit about you to really understand who you are and where you come from. So I'd like to ask you a little bit more about, I know you've worked with relief organizations, you've worked with victims of the tsunami. You were here a couple of times after the Easter Sunday attack, and you've been engaged with community leaders related to the Easter Sunday attack, especially with the Muslim community. Can you talk a little bit about your work during these conflicts, and if you've noticed a pattern, if you've noticed a trend, any challenges on that side or any successes on that side, anything that stands out for you in all of your years of working with Sri Lankan conflicts, especially with, say, the tsunami, Easter Sunday attack, floods, relief organizations, the civil war, something that stands out for you that will also help us get to know you a little bit more?
Yeah. So as I said, I was never born, never grew up, never lived in Sri Lanka. But after the tsunami, and the tsunami was a very personal thing to me. I lost 5 members of my mom's extended family were there. They were one of the ones directly affected, because we live in Saindamara, which is in the eastern province of Ampara. It was one of the first villages in the east to be hit. So, I immediately volunteered, right? I immediately came out. At that time there was a number of aid agencies that were coming out, and I immediately, I used to volunteer with an organization in the UK, and then so they were coming out and they asked me to join them, and I came out. In the first sort of, I think I flew out on the 27th of December 2004, so 26th, 27th, and that was a very weird flight. There was only like 2-3 of us on the whole flight, Sri Lankan Airlines from London. And so I came out and I helped to volunteer, come kind of clean up things, look at response, kind of think about these things. And then after a month I went back to the UK, because I'd obviously just taken leave. And then the organization that I was working for, I was still working as a civil engineer. They turned around and said, look, we understand you've had such a traumatic experience. If you want to take a year sabbatical, please go ahead. We're happy to kind of let that happen. So I gratefully took that. And at that time, Muslim Aid, which is a British Muslim-inspired NGO, they were looking for someone to help them, because they had got a project on building houses in collaboration with Oxfam. So they wanted someone to kind of do that, and I kind of fit the bill. I was local enough. I kind of knew the area, but I was also not local. I was international, so had that, they wanted someone in terms of oversight and accountability and everything else. I was also a civil engineer, so they wanted someone that. So they asked me whether I'd like to come out and help build houses there, and they had a particular project actually just outside of Katankuri in the east. They were building a new village, and so I came out. I came out to build those houses. It was it was called a peace village because it was actually a spot where there were communities that had been there during the conflict, and then due to the conflict, particularly the Muslim community, due to the conflict, some of the Tamils, they had been displaced from that area. It's in a village called Olikulam. So they had been displaced from Olikulam because of the conflict, and they had been displaced to Katankuri, but they were displaced to the shore. And obviously, with the tsunami, they were now displaced again, and they were displaced back because this was free land, and obviously, the conflict at that time there had been a ceasefire agreement, so it was relatively safe for them to go back. So they had been displaced back to the original, where they had originally come from, right? And so there was these families, Muslim families that were there, and then there were also some Tamil families that were there. So the Muslim Aid's idea was to build a village, 100 houses, whereby they were trying to bring the Muslims and Tamils together because it was sort of adjoining Tamil land that was there. So one of the particularities about Eastern Province is that you have a sandwich of villages, right? You have Muslim villages, Tamil villages, Muslim villages. So it was like that. So there was a border that was there. So Muslim Aid's view was to kind of build that. So I was tasked to kind of support that process of building that piece of work. My first reasoning for why I kind of got into peace building, particularly interfaith and intercultural peace building, was because of the house building in Sri Lanka. We were building these houses, right? We were building these houses for Muslims and Tamils to kind of live, and we kind of naively thought that, okay, they would live together, and so we built a model house, and we kind of brought the community in, and we kind of explained to them, this is the house, and this is how we're going to be doing it, and everything else. And both communities were like, yeah, this is great, we love it, love the house, this is better than what we had before. There's this one problem: we can't necessarily live next to each other. We can live as villages to villages, but we can't live house to house. I found that extremely interesting, right? So these are communities that have suffered from conflict, lost everything, and then suffered again because of tsunami, and they've been brought back. Yet even in that midst of that suffering and that loss, there was still a little bit of a lack of trust between them, right? So we ended up doing that. We ended up building a village for the Muslims, and then next to it a village for the Tamils. So we bought the separate land and we built there, and then we ensured that the way that they would kind of try and at least talk to each other was that there were community wells that were built so that they could get water. Again, none of the houses could get individual wells or anything else because the groundwater is quite high in that area. So it was difficult to kind of build that type of thing due to contamination. But so we built that. But I think that was my first kind of inclination about this. The second one for me was, coming in as a Muslim Aid. Obviously, it's a Muslim-inspired international humanitarian agency, right? Built on Islamic principles. But we never thought ourselves as a Muslim organization. But when I introduced myself to people on the ground, particularly in Colombo, their first inclination was, you're just here to help the Muslims. You're from Saudi. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not from Saudi, right? I'm from the UK. And so, I found it very interesting that there was this perception about who I was because of the name. And so I also wanted to ensure that we worked with communities. We worked regardless of who they were. We wanted to work. So, I actively then started to look at programs that would work with other communities. And so that was one of the second things that I did. I mean, and then I guess the third thing that really interested me was I remember one of the programs that we were doing, and we were trying to do some campaigns, and we went to meet a famous cricketer, right? I won't name the name, but he went to meet a famous cricketer, and we asked him for his endorsement on something, and he gave it. But he asked me a question. He goes, "Yeah, Muslim aid." I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Why are you becoming ethnic?" I said, "That struck me for." Because we should have single aid or Tamil aid, and then I had to explain to him, this is not how you view Muslims, right? This is because of something else. But then it really then dawned on me that the way that people perceive Muslims in Sri Lanka in particular is not just as a religious group, it is as an ethnic group as well, and which has other challenges. And so I think these were the three kind of things that sort of got me thinking about the position of Muslims there, and also helped to inspire why I would go on later on to do a PhD in this, because I just really wanted to understand where Muslims came from, how they've situated themselves, and what they want to do there. So I think those are the kind of the key things that were there. Having said that, I still say that working during the time of the conflict had its challenges, because it was a time of conflict, but it was also slightly easier than sort of post-conflict era, particularly I think in the post 2019 era. I think that you were very, very clear where your boundaries were, and you were very, very clear on what you could say, what you could not say. I think that has changed, that the dynamics have changed, the way that we approach the conflict, the way that we approach it very much changed, and even the relationships between and within communities also changed because of the conflict. So when I came back in 2014, it was a good time to come, and that obviously there's also a change in the political winds and everything else, but I did find it a little bit more challenging. It was challenging in a way I'd never experienced before. And when I left Sri Lanka in 2017, I said to myself, this is a changing atmosphere. This is something that I'm not comfortable with. I can give an example on that, right? So I think it's 2015 or 16, there was a very bad flood in Colombo or the Matakulia areas, massive flooding, right? Massive flooding that was there. Obviously, local communities were responding. One of the UN organizations organized a roundtable to discuss this. And again, because the challenge has been with humanitarian agencies in Sri Lanka was that their mandate was always conflict and tsunami, and so they always focused in the north and the east, because that's where most of them, and sometimes in the south because of the tsunami. They never focused on the rest of the world, or on the rest of the country, whether it's Kandy or this, because it was never sort of their mandate. Right? Sri Lanka was seen as a middle-income country emerging, but you had this issue of the north and the east because of the conflict, which is where there's also a negative perception about humanitarian agencies and NGOs and everything else. They often, it was often felt, the criticism was NGOs are not helping, they're just helping the Tamils, or they're helping the Muslims, mainly because the north and east was where the conflict and the tsunami happened, and that's where majority of the Muslims and Tamils are. They never sort of looked at the other parts, because the assumption was the government is looking after that, and they're not necessarily areas of conflict. But because the flooding was so bad, one of the UN agencies had sort of decided that we need to do something, and they were under pressure. So they called this roundtable, and they asked me to chair the roundtable. And they wanted to bring local community, they wanted to bring private sector, they wanted to bring the UN and other humanitarian agencies to a roundtable to discuss what can be done. And so they asked me to chair it. And then I was chairing the conversation. I was picking people to come and speak. So I picked people from local communities, I picked people from private sector, dialogue, all of those. I picked people from UN and other humanitarian agencies, asked them to speak. And then after the roundtable, someone came up to me and he goes, you're a very partial chair. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, you were not picking on everyone. I said, no, I had specific people I wanted to pick. And as we got into this argument, and he kept on saying that I was not fair, I was being biased, and everything else. In the end, I left it. But when I looked back and looked at the meeting notes, something struck me. and I realized what he was talking about. I had picked 10 people to speak. So I had picked sort of a couple of people from private sector, a couple of people from the UN, from local community. Now, the local community, obviously, majority of them, because they're in that sort of Mattapalli area, a lot of them are Muslim. I mean, that's where a lot of the Muslim community lives as well there. So a lot of the community representatives there had come to the mosque or whatever, and it was important for us to hear what they were saying, how they had responded, because, one of the things that we are talking about within the humanitarian development landscape is what we call localization, giving more power to local actors to work, because they're the first on the scene. They're often the affected communities. They need to be supported to respond. So I picked a couple of people there, 2 or 3 of them, they were Muslim. I picked a couple from Dialogue, from Mobitel, from Cargills and everything else. I picked a couple from WFP, UNHCR. Out of the 10 or 15 people that I picked, I think 7 happened to be Muslim. Now, out of the 7 that were Muslim, 2 or 3 of them were from the local community. The rest were there because they represented Dialogue, or that represented the UN organization there. They were there representing their organization. And it was just by coincidence that they happened to be Muslim, and it hadn't struck me. It hadn't struck me. Right? But then I reflected afterwards, saying that this is probably what that person was saying, that he felt that me as a Muslim, I was only picking up on Muslims to speak, which was a bit unfair, because a lot of these people who spoke were not speaking because they were Muslim, they're speaking because they represented an organization. They happened to be Muslim. But that really kind of struck a negative chord with me, because I really felt that troubling sign of where the country was going to, where they would really look at your ethnicity and or your religion, and they would take that into consideration, right? So that was one of the troubling things that are there. And then, of course, from 2014 to 2017, I think there was a real sense that perhaps some of the newer, younger generation MPs coming in were a little bit more open-minded and could help in some of the diaspora engagement, having a conversation with the diaspora, recognizing that is there. And so in 2016, we had a conference where we did a roadmap for the foreign ministry around overseas Sri Lankans, how they can engage positively overseas Sri Lankans at that stage to help in sort of cultural, technological, economical, political sort of work to help Sri Lanka. I think that some of those recommendations are still there. I know that there's now a unit on overseas Sri Lankans that's at the foreign ministry. I think that came from one of our recommendations. So I think that there are some things there that I can point to that are I guess successes. But I think some of the challenges, like I said, particularly when I came back in 2014, was I think the climate of some of these conversations, even pre-2019, the climate of distrust, climate of suspicion, climate that particularly the Muslim community felt, the pressure was there. You had at that time BBS was still there, and you had a lot of challenges with halal certification, dress code, all of that, and then you had the alutkama and the digana, and all of those things were, these were the start of that process, right? So I think that you will begin to find a real tension in the atmosphere on community relationships, and a real tension that faith leaders had in terms of trying to kind of hold communities together. And I think these were some of the challenges, I think, particularly that came up in my second round.
Thank you, Amjad. Just holding on to that thought of climate. We're talking about the climate that you experienced when you came back and the tension. I'd like to hold on to that a little bit and move into my next question for you, which is around 2019, when Sri Lanka experienced an Easter Sunday terror attack. This was a coordinated series of suicide bombers walking into churches and hotels and blowing themselves up, and as a result killing hundreds of people. And now it's been 5 years since then, and there has been as someone who has, to some extent, been involved with the Easter Sunday attack post-conflict situation in the country, or been involved in some of those conversations or stories that have been shared, there has been a sort of a very palpable tension or climate around that issue, especially when we come to why you're here talking with me, community engagement and community leadership around that conflict and that terror attack. Um, have you had a chance to, considering that you worked on Muslim identity transformation, and you've been interested in the Muslim community's role in peace building in Sri Lanka, and you've worked in conflict resolution for various conflicts. When we talk especially about the Easter Sunday attack and what has happened after, since 2019, what are your thoughts, coming from the fact that you come from a father who has been a community leader or who engaged with community work, and then yourself going down that a very similar path? What are your thoughts on leadership around that attack?
So that's a good question. I'm going to preface this by sort of saying that we need, when we look at the Easter Sunday attacks, right? It can't be seen in isolation from what the country has gone through, right? And I think, and I say this very deliberately, because I think that since independence, I think there has always been, talk to any analyst in Sri Lanka, talk particularly on peace and everything, is they will sort of tell you roughly that they've sort of tracked that every 10 years or so there has been a violent conflict that has arisen in Sri Lanka, right? And they've tracked this sort of there, and so they point back to sort of from independence, maybe roughly around 1956 there was something, then roughly around towards the end of the 60s, towards the 70s, obviously with the JVP insurrection, and then in 83, and then from 83 to 2009 you had a number of series of violent this thing there, right? But then from 2009 to 2019. So I think the first thing to kind of preface is the fact that this is not something that just came out of nowhere. That there is a history of violent incidents in Sri Lanka. That is there. Second one is to also kind of see is that the cause of those violent incidents largely is, it has been marginalization of communities. The denial of basic rights, particularly to the minorities, an issue of social mobility, right? A fight against the elites and things like that, wanting voices to be heard. So that's the second aspect of it. And then of course there are those analysts who also then kind of sort of also talk about the role of the deep state in some of these incidents and things like that. So first and foremost, I think we need to kind of preface that perspective there, right? So Easter Sunday was absolutely shocking. It was something that no one expected. But if you analyze it was something that no one expected from the Muslim community. But if you analyze the trajectory of things from at least since independence, it sort of fit that bill of every 10 years there's a conflict, right? Every 10 years there's a violent conflict. Let me put it that way, because conflict is not necessarily bad. I also want to say that, right? Conflict in itself is not a bad thing, right? It's just when it becomes violent is a bad thing. And so from the peace building perspective, we talk about 5 factors of conflict. We talk about the rule of law, access to income and assets, shaping your political future, safety and well-being. If one of these 5 factors are in deficit or weak, the propensity for violent conflict arises. But if they're all in balance, you will still have conflict, but it's not going to be violent. And conflict by itself is not a bad thing. It spurs differences of thinking, and it spurs that challenge. So if you analyze Sri Lanka along those five factors, you will see that over the last 75 plus years, one of those five factors have always been, or one or two more of those five factors have always been deficit, and so that propensity for violence is there. So I think that's the first thing, right? I think that there was, particularly, I think since 2010, there was this growing sense of feeling of isolation, feeling of marginalization, feeling of hopelessness and helplessness from the Muslim community, because they felt like there was this deliberate targeting, challenging of their identity, right? And this is where the kind of the challenge of the ethnic versus the religious kind of thing comes in, right? Because some of the things, for example, having a mosque, halal, the hijab, all of those things are also religious sort of edicts, but they also play it out as an ethnic marker. And so by deliberately challenging those, and I don't need to sort of, this thing everyone knows about what happened during those times when halal certification, or whether it's the wearing of the hijab or whatever, and then the obviously the targeting of mosques and everything else, religious grounds, that basically meant to the Muslim community that they were no longer welcome, that they were challenged, their very existence was being challenged, and that caused a lot of tension, and that caused a lot of anxiety and frustration. So that's the external sort of lens. The internal lens as well is that, of course, there's a large disconnect between the communities, right? Between the Muslim community. The Muslim community is not homogeneous in Sri Lanka. It never was, right? We again, that's the problem when you sort of say the Muslim community, right? You kind of assume that we're all the same, we all eat the same. No, we don't, right? We don't, right? Depending on where you live, you have different perspectives. The Eastern, and we've always had this, Eastern province Muslims, the Northern, Southern, Western, Central, right? So there is a disconnect within the community. There's a disconnect between leadership and young people, huge disconnect, and so all of this comes to play with then the terrible incidents of Easter Sunday, which then has exacerbated those tensions, right? So I think that in that sense, I think that there's two aspects to it. One is, of course, the leadership of the community trying to understand the pushes and pulls. I mean, because violence and violent extremism is about the push and the pull. What pushes people into committing acts of violence, particularly if they're marginalized, right? And they have nowhere else to go, or they're seeking significance or whatever. And if you look at those people who become violent extremists or terrorists, whatever, right? There's often kind of two or three this thing, because it's one aspect is the foot soldiers, who are often they do it not because they ideologically believe in it. It's just that they get paid, or there's money for their family or whatever, and so there's a push factor in terms of economics. The second one is often a large portion of these people are actually quite intelligent, right? And they come from well-to-do family, and you don't need to look. You can look across, but who are the sort of radicals, or who are the people who they often come from. Actually, they're quite intellectual. They're quite radical. They're quite well off and things like that. And that's because they're seeking something else. They're seeking significance. They're seeking some sort of wanting to make a difference. They're seeking ownership, and they want things like that. So I think that you have to kind of look at it like that. That there is, of course, a disconnect within the community that is there, and I'm happy to kind of explore that a little bit more with you. But then there's also the external circumstances that have been there, and that has been building up. Actually, it's not just with Alut Kama and Digana and all of that, and the halal issues, there has been systematically things where the Muslim community has felt like they don't necessarily matter in this, but then that is a sentiment that unfortunately the minorities as a whole kind of feel in Sri Lanka, right? They are not necessarily welcome in Sri Lanka, and some of the narrative around that has gone to kind of reinforce that. And for sort of the last maybe 20 years since that has been targeted towards the Muslim community, we're seeing elements of that targeting the Christian community, who are also a minority, except there's an additional challenge in that because Christians are also from the majority ethnic community as well. So that is a thing, but you can see that targeting of sort of the non-majority religious ethnic identity. And so all of that has been building up. And so what you need to do is kind of have a community leadership that recognizes that, understands the trajectory, and sort of works towards that. But it's not in isolation of the external circumstances, right? So even you as a community can do as much as you want, but if the external circumstances are pushing people towards something, then it's there's only so much you can do. If the external circumstances if the narrative is always sort of against you and everything else, and you see physically what people are doing, and it's not computing, you don't see any justice in that or whatever, then you're going to have a time when those people, there will be a few people who will go, okay, fine, we have to take matters into our own hands. And then those are the people that then can get manipulated into doing something. There. So for me, Easter Sunday in the whole grand scheme of things is significant because it signifies a change of trajectory of how Sri Lanka should look like, and the Muslim community was suddenly brought in. And so if you kind of analyze it, each of the three main communities in Sri Lanka have been involved in some level of violent uprising against the state, against the country, whether it's the Sinhalese, whether it's the Tamils, whether it's the Muslims. And I think that should raise other conversations around why is that this thing? Why would that happen? Right? If you have in all three communities, people have risen up violently in that sense, then that symbolizes then there has to be something that we need to think about. And I'm hoping that, well, that's the ambition, is that would have happened, but unfortunately it didn't, and it actually then perpetuated something else, which is a much more deeper focus and scrutiny on the Muslim community, internal fighting, and who is the legitimate voice of the Muslim community, who is the good Muslim, who is the bad Muslim. And I think that's where the problem is now, that we are in a state of that. This thing in the Muslim community has sort of not been able to recover from that, not be able to have a conversation on that.
Thank you, Amjad. I'd like to talk a little bit more about what you were just saying. We were currently talking about what has happened in the past. We were mostly talking about pre-Easter Sunday attack and how that basically contributed to Easter Sunday attack, and how basically what happened in the past led to what happened in 2019. You also mentioned that there is a strong disconnect between the old and the young in the Muslim community, that there's a disconnect within as well, and that when we say Muslim community, people sometimes assume that we're all the same, but we're not. We're very different. We have different sects, we have different kinds of people, we have different kinds of understanding of what religion is, and that's all fine and well. In particular to Sri Lanka's context and Sri Lanka's Muslim community, is there something you'd like to share, or something you've learned through your PhD of understanding the transformation of Muslim identity, in how this disconnect is playing out, and what could that contribute to the future? Like, what could the future entail if this disconnect continues?
Yeah. So I'm going to be controversial here, right? Because for me, the concept. So first and foremost, the concept of Muslims as an ethnic identity, which is what we have come to be known as, right? That Muslims are like the third ethnicity in Sri Lanka. I mean, that for me is a fallacy, right? Because Islam was never an ethnic identity. It came in and absorbed different things. So the concept of a Muslim identity is something that, we need to kind of change that, right? I mean, within the Muslim community, you have Malays, you have Moors, people call themselves Moors, you have Maimans, you have Boras, you also have Sinhalese, you have Tamils, you have all of these people who are there, right? So I think that's there. Secondly, I think that there's a narrative that we put as a Muslim community, right? We often talk about this. We often sort of say that Muslims have been here for thousand years, and we've coexisted, right? As if we all came as one group of people. We suddenly arrived by boat or one day and decided to settle as Muslims. We didn't, right? Islam has come through many things. Yes, it came through the Arabs, right? Arab traders came, right? Arab traders came and they settled. This is where the origin of the Moor kind of thing comes in. Where this thing, but they didn't come with their wives. They came and they married local people, right? They married Sinhalese or Tamils, depending on where they settled, right? We don't recognize that heritage of ours, right? That most of us are actually, yes, and then, after the Portuguese, a lot of the influence of Islam came from South India, which is why Tamil became the predominant vernacular of the Muslim community, because a lot of the influence was coming from South India. But somehow we still go back to Muslims came 1,000 years ago. We didn't. Islam came 1,000 years ago. We've been here. Islam came like Christianity came, right? All of these things. We've been here. We are part and parcel of this country. There's not, we're not immigrants like in Europe. Like we arrived. No, we've been there. Islam came. And as a result, Arabs and Muslims intermarried with people. We have Sinhalese Muslims, we have Tamil Muslims, we have people who claim, yes, you can claim Moorish heritage, because there are some of us who can claim that there's Moors, there's Maimans, there's Boras, there's Afghans, there's all of these people are part of that community. There's Malays. Yet somehow Muslims become the overall thing, and then within that Muslims we actually discriminate against the rest, right? We don't really consider the Malays. We don't really consider the Maimans. They're Bais. We call them Bais, right? We call them those because they're different. They have a different. Even their school of thought is different and everything else. But that's it. So I think first and foremost, that's the perspective that we need to do. And then of course, many Muslims, particularly in those who are in the central province and everything else, they have Sinhalese heritage. Some of them were granted Sinhalese titles. Some of them actually intermarried. We kind of forget that. So I think the first and foremost for us to really kind of rethink how we are classifying and identifying ourselves as Muslims, because I think that's the first and foremost. And then also to kind of sort of say that this country, yes, it has a historical relationship with Buddhism. That's fine. I think that for us is not an issue. There are majority people there, but if the country belongs to all, then we all have a role to play in that, right? And so I think that's the first bit of the conversation. The concept of even Muslims as a separate ethnicity is political. It's political. It goes back to the late 18th century. You might have heard the famous Ramanathan Aziz debates that took place, right? Where basically there was a fight for political representation at the legislature. So even our own kind of thing that we are different as Muslims comes from that political perspective. That we wanted a seat on the legislative council, And so we distinguished ourselves from the Sinhalese or the Tamils. And we, in fact, from the Tamils, we distinguished ourselves, saying, we have a different culture, we speak different English, different Tamil, we dress differently. Yes, all of those things are there. So that is how we distinguish ourselves. So I think that's part of the conversation that needs to happen. But that can't happen without the wider conversation around minorities, around role of minorities, around how does the country in itself represent and recognize the diversity that it has. And Sri Lanka has multiple diversities. I was amazed to I think that actually if you boil it down, there's at least about 12 or 13 different ethnicities or identities that one can have. It's not just sort of the three main ones that we think about, right? There's actually 12 different. We never talk about that. And so I think part of that conversation is there's an external environment that needs to talk about, okay, how does the country absorb and talk about this pluralistic society, this multicultural diversity that it has? And then, of course, from the Muslim community perspective is how do we situate, how do we see ourselves as a community, as citizens of this country? What are our rights, what are our responsibilities, what are our privileges? And I think that's the start of the conversation. I don't think we've had that, whether externally as a country, we don't have that. We're not talking about that, and internally as well within the Muslim community, we don't talk about that, right? We don't talk about that. We don't have that conversation about what is our role, who are we, how do we situate ourselves as citizens of this? What does that mean for us? We're always sort of talking about, okay, what is our rights? Okay, we need this, we need this, we need this. But actually, what is it? What is that space that we can negotiate on this?
Thank you, Amjad. So my final question to you, Amjad, would be, considering all that we've spoken about in this past hour, back here in Sri Lanka, today is Easter Sunday for those who are celebrating Easter. In about a month, the 21st of April, we will mark 5 years since that terror attack that shocked all of us. In that 5-year space, there have been a lot of conversations, there have been a lot of arguments and debates and disagreements as well around the whole attack, and it's a very controversial space to be in. While I understand all of that, I've picked up on a few strands of thought that have been getting a little louder as the years go by, and one that I'd like to discuss with you is that don't dig wounds that are healing is a narrative that comes out of a set of people, individuals, communities, not specific to Muslims. This could come out of non-Muslims as well. And I'd like to run you through, or like to hear your thoughts on, when we're faced with a conflict, especially if it's violent extremism and terrorism, or goes to the extent of civil war or insurgency, conflict in general that is violent, and years pass or time passes and people demand that this not be spoken about again because it brings back traumatic memories, or because in their perspective the wounds have been healed. As a peace builder yourself, as someone who's worked with communities and led communities, what would you say is the ideal response to this train of thought popping out from different sections of community? Is responding or is talking about a terror attack a not so great thing to do as years roll by, or is it something that should be buried and forgotten, and the space to heal should, through silence, take place? What are your thoughts on all of this?
So thanks, Amina. It's a very interesting question, right? So I actually disagree with that, right? And I'll tell you kind of a couple of things why I disagree with that. First and foremost, one of the things that we're very good at in that part of the world is we don't show emotions. We don't display, particularly if you're a male, right? And I'll tell you, I have personal experience on this, right? My father passed away last year, unexpectedly. It was a very sudden thing. I managed to get home so that I could bury him, right? But it was very, very traumatic. It still is traumatic. I still grieve. But it was interesting for me, and obviously maybe this is part coming from the Western European this thing. There was an expectation on me as the only son to sort of keep calm and carry on. Don't, and I was actually told this, right? Don't show your emotions to your mom. You have to be strong. You have to, this thing, you can't cry, you can't do this, you can't do that. And I found that extremely strange, right? I was like, well, what the hell? I just lost my dad. Why is it that I can't show emotions, right? And then I came back and I talked to a friend of mine who's from Pakistan, who's a peace builder. He's in the US. And he said, that's the problem, right? In our part of the world. And I think we've inherited that almost a Victorian British stiff upper lip. Keep calm, carry on, don't show emotions, that bottle it up. But all the mental health studies show you that if you bottle it up, it will explode at one point. And so what you're encouraged to do is to actually go to talk to someone, to talk to a therapist, to go to a victims group, to go to a healing group. You're taught to talk through that process of grief so that you come to terms with that and you don't bottle it up inside, because it can have adverse mental and physical actions to you. In that sense, if we now scale that up and sort of say within the context of a country like Sri Lanka, where it has, and we're not talking about the trauma of Easter Sunday. We're talking of the trauma of a lot of things, whether it's the 71, whether it's the 83, whether it's the 2000 and the 96 central bank attack, whether it's in 2009, whether it's 1990, all of those, there's trauma. We have accumulated a hell of a lot of trauma in Sri Lanka, and we're bottling it up. At some point, it's going to erupt, and it'll erupt in different ways. And part of that trauma then gets reinforced because you marginalize, you exclude, you prevent. People feel like their voices are not heard. People feel like, and so I think that there is a mistake that's being done there, because we're not able to talk about it. Now, I do agree that we can't expect, even after 5 years, that some of that healing will have happened, or some of that forgiveness would have happened. So it takes time. And so the healing and the reconciliation process takes time. It might even take generations, but it needs to be done parallelly to all the other things. As an international system, that we're very good at sort of saying, after a conflict, there are certain things you need to do, certain structural things you need to do that are there. You have reconciliation, you have these programs, you have that, you have disarmament, you have demilitarization, you have de-radicalization programs. All those are the structural elements that are in place, but they can't be done without I call them the hardware. They can't be done without the software, which is once again building trust and relationship between communities. And to build trust between communities has to be around building relationships, getting to know each other, respecting each other. That for me is what my father always used to say was the role of the religious leaders, the faith leaders, the community leaders. So you absolutely can't bury that, because if you bury that, at some point it will erupt once again, because there will always be this feeling of injustice that has not been fulfilled, and these conflicts can come up at all levels. And so you can't just artificially ask people to stop that. You need to talk about it. And at some point, if you don't talk about it, maybe in the future, people might even deny it. I mean, this is what we're seeing now, for example, in parts of Europe, right? People are denying what happened in Bosnia. They're denying that because there was a bit of an artificial way of sort of solving this issue, right? They're denying that. So we can't bury that, but we need to now understand how we go through a process of healing that allows people to talk about it in a way, in a safe space, that allows people to understand there. And most of the people just want an acknowledgement of their hurt. I mean, we often misinterpreted the fact that if we are allowing people to talk about the healing, they want justice to be solved, and they want that. Often they're not even at that stage of they want justice. They're at that stage of I just want to be recognized for the trauma and the grief that I'm going through, right? And then later on, maybe I might even think about justice or not. But if you're not even allowing me the agency to go through that grief, you're perpetuating that perspective. So I think that part of what it is that we need to kind of create those spaces for people to have those conversations, to be able to heal, to be able to understand each other, to be able to understand the grief. And there's a lot of grief and trauma in Sri Lanka. The latest one actually is not even, I mean, let's not even, I mean, Easter Sunday, but let's talk about COVID. Let's talk about the forced cremations, right? I speak to people who lost loved ones during COVID and who were not even able to bury them because they were either cremated or they were sent to the east to be buried. They didn't. There's a lot of grief and trauma there. That's there. And we're not recognizing, and we're continuously perpetuating that. And we're also perpetuating this, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots is beginning to rise. We're beginning to marginalize, isolate people. And once people are marginalized, isolated, they will hang on to something that gives them a level of hope or level of recognition, a level of authority, a level of agency. And if it's the wrong type of person giving them that, they will be pushed into that. So I think that's the challenge that we have. And again, I want to kind of, I know we're talking about Easter Sunday, and I think it's very important, and there's an important role the Muslim community has to play in understanding what went wrong, both from the external and from internal. And I know that, I know I didn't really talk about that, but, we do have a huge role to play in addressing that. We were almost like ostriches, where we didn't really see the marginalization of young people in our communities. We didn't really deal with extreme ideologies coming in, or we also tended to kind of think, okay, they're just on the side, we don't need to worry about them because we're okay. But actually, we should have provided more opportunities for this. We should have provided more opportunities for some of these young people who were radicalized by Zahran. We should have had them in our radar screen. We didn't, and I think that's a feeling that we need to kind of think about. And it goes back to, again, where are the youth? Where are the women in our spaces? We don't have them. Most of the Muslim organizations, there's no young person in leadership. Even the so-called young associations, the young Muslims or young this thing, none of the leadership is young. Everyone is old, right? And there's no space. If you're young, there's no space to come up, to have your voice heard, to have your thoughts listened. There's no space for a difference of opinion. There's no space for women. So as a consequence, they go online. And online, if you're not careful, there's enough studies to show that if you can be radicalized easily online because there's no filter. So there's a lot of work to be done there from our perspective. And then obviously there's a lot of work within the external environment. But we absolutely need to be able to talk about this. We need to be able to talk about some of these things, because there's trauma. We're expected just to carry on, and I don't think we're able to do that anymore.
Thank you so much, Amjad. I really appreciate this. I hope you did have a good time and that
I did. Thank
this
you.
was...
Sorry, I've gone all over the place. I'm not sure I really
No,
answered your questions,
loved
but I
it.
hope that I provided some
You did.
clarity.
You did provide a very interesting perspective, and I just can't wait to get the whole transcript down and see what I can learn from it as well. This is what I do with all my guests. I get it all transcribed and read through the whole thing and use it as sort of study material a little bit. And I'm sorry for troubling you on a Sunday.
No, it's
Thank you
my
so
pleasure.
much for doing this.
Thank you for it's